Hello, I'm Mr. Polk, and welcome to my kitchen. Today what I'd like to do is show you how to make a pizza dough with yeast. So the way we're going to start is we're going to start with our flour. And if you remember in class when we learned about the flours, we learned about the gluten potential, and we learned all the way up to bread flour. For pizza, you really need that strength of the gluten structure that's developed. So we're going to use flour that has even more protein than what we're used to using. We're going to use what's called a high gluten flour. And if you don't have that at home and you want to use a standard bread flour, that's fine. Or if you want to use a tipo flour or whatever you have is fine. But ideally, if you want to make it more like the pizza shops, you want to have the high gluten flour. And that's going to provide a really strong structure. Then what's going to go in there is just a little bit of the sugar, the teaspoon of sugar, the half teaspoon of salt. That was about a pound of flour that I put in. And then you're going to do your yeast. And for the yeast I want to use, we have the Fleischmann style, the blue. It doesn't matter what brand, but you want it to be the instant yeast, the rapid rise. Okay, you want this to be the yeast that you don't have to, if you remember from the lessons, you don't have to start it in a sponge or anything like that. We can put it in dry. Okay, these have real fine granules, so we're just going to sprinkle the yeast right in, and it'll activate from there. Then you're going to go into your mixer, and if you don't have a mixer, it's okay. You can mix this up by hand. But one of the things that people always think about, they know that they have to use the hook, all right? But they don't realize that you shouldn't start with the hook. When you start with the hook, all it does is like flips the flour around. Okay, what we want to do is start with our traditional paddle, the flat beater. And when you put it in, just start it on stir, and we're going to bring it around. And once you bring it around, then we can turn it into the dough. Now, there's not a lot of ingredients. There's just the wet that's left. 2 tablespoons of a good olive oil, and then your water. Water is important. The recipe tells you to have it around 90 degrees. If the water's too cold, the yeast activates slowly. If it's too hot, you could kill the yeast. The yeast dies at 140 degrees. So your water really should never be over 120, because at 120 your yeast does get compromised. So I have this at about 90 degrees, and then what I like to do is I'm going to put in about half of the water, because dough, you can never give an exact amount. And then I'm just going to turn this off quick and put my oil in, just because it's in glass. Turn that back on. And what I'm looking for is I want to start adding the water till it makes kind of a soft dough. Alright, now you don't want your dough to be dry, but you don't want it to be super, super wet. We like our dough, pizza dough should be soft, and we like it to have what we like to say tact, meaning that when you press it, it has a tacky feel, but it doesn't let residue. So once it starts to look like this, all right, and I'll take it out so you can see it. Once it starts to look like this, you're ready to switch to the dough hook. And this type of thing is nice because you can see that it has some dry spots, but it has a lot of wet spots in it, which is all going to come together. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, for this step, I usually like a pair of gloves because you get the dough, the wet tacky dough all over your hands. And what I'm going to do is just get as much of that off of the flat beater as I can. See here, this dough that's coming off is super, super wet. So when it combines with the stuff in the bottom that's not so wet, it'll really make a nice soft dough. So here you can see what we have so far. It's got, the wet spots, the dry, we'll bring it all together. And then there's some dry in the bottom of the bowl. And then now what we're going to do is use the dough hook. Now, if you're doing it by hand, I'll show you a little later how to knead it by hand. If you're going to use the dough hook to knead it, to develop that gluten structure, the KitchenAid always recommends you run it on a speed 2. So we're going to turn it on, and we're going to put it on 2, and we're just going to watch it. And we're going to let it go around until it starts to develop the gluten and passes what we like to call the membrane test or the Windowpane test. So you can see after it kneads for a few minutes, the gluten structure starts to develop, and one of the things you can tell that you have the dough right is if you can see in the bowl is what we call clean. The dough isn't sticking to the bottom, it's not flopping around because it's too dry, it's just picked up all of the flour and it's working correctly. And now I'm going to turn the mixer off, And what we're going to do is take a look at the dough. So I want you to see how what we call the tack, and that it's tacky, but it's not like sticking. So when I put it in my hands, you hear that noise? You want to hear that noise. That's the tack. You can see it stick to my hand a little bit, but I'm not, turning into a big dough mess. And then what we want to do is test the dough. So we take a chunk off, and you can do this while it's still in the mixer. This is called the Windowpane Test, the membrane test. And what you do is, if the gluten is developed correctly, you make a ball like this, and then you hold it up to the light. And you carefully stretch it with your hands. And you want to be able to see through it. A lot of people say it's almost like when the gum gets really thick that you can blow a bubble. That's why I call it the Windowpane test, is that you can actually see through it. When you can see through it, then you know that the gluten is developed. Now some people say, oh, it's just how I pull it. No, if you do this early and it's not ready, it's going to break. The strands are going to tear. Here you can see that the strands are nice and flexible, okay? And that's what you want. See that? That way you know that that's ready to go. So what I do is I take my ball of dough, and I just want to show you, you don't really have to knead it anymore because it's ready to go. But I do want to show you, just in case you don't have the mixer and you're going to knead by hand. What we'll do, first of all, is we'll take our ball of dough. We'll do this normally. Pull it from the mixer. And I like to gather the ends in my hand. And then I take the heel of this hand and then my palm, and I just work it. And I go back and forth like this to bring it into a ball. And that's ready to go. If I was kneading this by hand, I would press down with my heel. I would knead it. Then I would fold it, turn it, and then keep going. And that folding and turning is how you would manually knead your dough until it hits the Windowpane stage. So I'm just going to pull it back together. Again, you don't have to knead it when it comes out of the mixer, but I want you to see that process so that you know what to do. Then you just hit it with your hand a little bit like that. And then this is ready to go. Now, as we learned from the lessons, the first phase is we have to bulk ferment. So I like to spray a bowl, and then I like to spray the bottom, and I like to spray that. And then what you're going to do is, once it gets like this, then you're going to cover it in saran wrap, and then you're going to let it bulk. And what we like to do is we like to say that it should bulk to it's twice the size. Okay. Then we're going to take it, and then this will go, you can do this two ways. You can do this in the refrigerator and let it sit overnight, and it will slowly bulk up. That gives you really great flavor, and it also allows you, it allows the yeast to process the flour and produce the carbohydrates, and that actually helps to create a browner crust because it processes with the sugars. The other thing is you could, if you want to do your dough in a hurry, you can just let this sit out in a draft-free environment that's warm, not too hot, because remember the yeast dies at 140, so someplace warm, and just allow it to double in size, and then we'll take a look at how it looks next. The only thing you could also do when you make your dough, I didn't put it in today because I wanted this to be more like dough you could make at home, but one of the ingredients that I like to use is something called a diastatic malt powder. And when you use that, it's an enzyme. So if you can get that somewhere, if you ever hear about it, it's an enzyme that you can put in the dough, about a teaspoon. It's on the recipe. And what that does is that helps work with the yeast to process the sugars even more. So that's something that if you weren't going to do it overnight and you were going to do it quick, it allows it to process more sugar, and it helps to give you a nicer, browner crust. So there you go. That's how you make your dough. And the next step after it bulks up, I'll show you how to make the pizza. So thanks for cooking with me today right here at Mr. Polk's Kitchen.